On the morning of May 7, 1954, Ho Chi Minh was not present at Dien Bien Phu. He was in the Viet Minh headquarters in the northern jungle, receiving reports by courier as French resistance collapsed inside the valley fortress. By the time the final bunker fell, more than 11,000 French soldiers were captured, and the war France had fought in Indochina for 8 years was effectively over. Yet Ho Chi Minh did not celebrate the battle itself. He understood that Dien Bien Phu was not a triumph of tactics alone. It was the visible endpoint of a political and organizational strategy that had been unfolding for decades, one that prioritized endurance, control, and legitimacy over battlefield brilliance. Vietnam was not won by decisive victories in the conventional sense. It was won by building an authoritarian system capable of outlasting opponents who measured success in battles rather than time. Ho Chi Minh's authority did not originate from military rank or battlefield command. Born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890 in central Vietnam, he spent much of his early adult life outside the country, working as a laborer, cook, and political organizer in France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. By the time he helped found the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930, he had internalized Leninist ideas about revolutionary organization and state power. From the beginning, Ho understood that armed struggle was only one instrument among many. The central task was to create a disciplined political movement capable of monopolizing authority, suppressing rivals, and presenting itself as the sole legitimate representative of Vietnamese nationalism. This approach became evident during World War II. When Japan occupied French Indochina, Ho returned to Vietnam in 1941 and formed the Viet Minh, a broad front organization nominally open to multiple political tendencies but tightly controlled by communists. The Viet Minh's early military actions against the Japanese were limited and symbolic. Far more significant was its expansion of parallel governance structures in rural areas, including taxation systems, courts, education cells, and security committees. By 1945, when Japan surrendered and the French colonial administration collapsed, the Viet Minh already exercised de facto authority over large parts of northern Vietnam without having won major battles. Ho declared independence in Hanoi on September 2, 1945, citing both the American Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution, a calculated move aimed at international legitimacy rather than immediate military confrontation. The subsequent war against France revealed the core logic of Ho's authoritarian strategy. French commanders consistently sought decisive engagements to destroy Viet Minh forces. Ho and his military commander, Vo Nguyen Giap, avoided such battles whenever possible during the early years. Between 1946 and 1949, the Viet Minh suffered heavy losses, lacked heavy weapons, and were repeatedly driven from urban centers. Yet they survived because the political structure remained intact. Party cells penetrated villages, controlled food distribution, enforced discipline, and eliminated non-communist nationalist competitors. Between 1945 and 1950, thousands of rival nationalists were imprisoned or executed by Viet Minh security forces. These actions were not incidental excesses. They were deliberate measures to ensure that when independence came, there would be no alternative centers of authority. The Chinese Communist victory in 1949 transformed Ho's position. With direct access to Chinese training, weapons, and sanctuary, the Viet Minh expanded from a guerrilla force into a hybrid army. Even then, Ho's leadership resisted premature offensives. Giap later acknowledged that early attempts at conventional warfare in 1951 resulted in disastrous losses, including tens of thousands of casualties during attacks on French positions in the Red River Delta. The lesson was absorbed. Military operations would be subordinated to political survival. Battles were chosen not to win quickly, but to wear down French will, increase costs, and reinforce the narrative of inevitable Vietnamese victory. Dien Bien Phu itself reflected this logic. The French chose the battlefield, hoping to force a decisive engagement. Ho approved Giap's plan only after months of logistical preparation, including the mobilization of more than 200,000 civilian porters to haul artillery and supplies through mountainous terrain. Even then, Giap delayed the final assault when he judged losses would be unsustainable. Victory came not from superior maneuver, but from overwhelming the French position through attrition and isolation. The battle mattered less for its tactical lessons than for its psychological and political consequences. Within weeks, France entered negotiations that led to the Geneva Accords and the temporary division of Vietnam. After 1954, Ho Chi Minh presided over the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, where authoritarian control intensified. Land reform campaigns between 1953 and 1956 resulted in the execution or imprisonment of tens of thousands of landlords and perceived class enemies. Internal party documents later admitted to excesses, but the campaigns achieved their primary objective: the destruction of independent rural elites and the consolidation of party authority at the village level. The state's capacity to extract resources, manpower, and compliance increased dramatically. By the time the conflict with South Vietnam and the United States escalated in the early 1960s, North Vietnam possessed a level of social penetration unmatched by its adversaries. The war against the United States followed the same strategic pattern as the war against France, scaled to a global power. Ho Chi Minh did not command battlefield operations directly, but he set the political parameters within which they occurred. The goal was never to defeat American forces outright. It was to make continued involvement politically unsustainable. Between 1965 and 1973, the United States dropped more tonnage of bombs on Vietnam than it had during World War II. North Vietnam absorbed the punishment, relocated industry, dispersed populations, and maintained command cohesion. Losses were staggering. Estimates suggest that between 1955 and 1975, North Vietnam and Allied forces suffered over 1 million military deaths. Yet the leadership accepted these losses as the cost of strategic endurance. The Tet Offensive of 1968 illustrates the paradox at the heart of Ho's strategy. Militarily, Tet was a disaster for the communist forces. Tens of thousands of fighters were killed, and no major cities were held. Politically, it shattered American confidence. The offensive contradicted official U.S. claims that victory was near and exposed the limits of military metrics such as body counts and territory controlled. Ho died in 1969, but the system he built continued to operate according to the same logic. Peace negotiations, battlefield pressure, and political warfare proceeded simultaneously, with no expectation of quick resolution. What distinguished Ho Chi Minh's approach from that of his opponents was not ideological zeal alone, but structural realism. He understood that modern wars between unequal powers are decided less by tactical outcomes than by the alignment of political systems with strategic objectives. France and the United States fought wars constrained by domestic opinion, electoral cycles, and institutional fragmentation. North Vietnam fought a war in which dissent was criminalized, information was controlled, and sacrifice was enforced through party discipline. This asymmetry did not guarantee victory, but it reshaped the timeline on which victory was possible. By the time Saigon fell in April 1975, Ho Chi Minh had been dead for 6 years, yet the outcome reflected his long-term vision. Vietnam was unified under a single-party state that had survived 3 decades of near-continuous war against vastly superior military forces. The victory did not rest on a catalog of decisive battles. It rested on the construction of an authoritarian system capable of absorbing punishment, eliminating alternatives, and maintaining strategic coherence over time. Ho Chi Minh did not win by defeating his enemies on the battlefield. He won by ensuring that eventually they would decide the war was no longer worth fighting. In the decades since, historians have debated the moral and human cost of this strategy. The suffering was immense, the repression real, and the losses irreversible. Yet from a strictly historical perspective, Ho Chi Minh's approach demonstrated a harsh truth about modern conflict. Wars are not always won by those who fight best, but by those who organize power most effectively over the long term. Vietnam's outcome was shaped not by a single battle or campaign, but by a disciplined refusal to lose before the enemy chose to stop. That refusal, enforced through authoritarian control, defined the war's trajectory and its conclusion, leaving a legacy that continues to shape Vietnam's political and social landscape today.